Everybody, and welcome to another episode of My JavaScript Story. This week we're talking to Ryan McDermott. Ryan, do you want to say hello?
Hey everyone, it's good to be back on.
Yeah, we had you on episode 259 talking about clean code JavaScript, which was, if I remember right, a GitHub repo that you had posted a bunch of stuff in and was really cool.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I was, it was beginning of 2017, and I posted that after kind of rereading clean code again, and I had been doing a lot of JavaScript and still do, and I noticed that there wasn't an adaptation for a lot of those concepts, and a lot of folks, I think, were kind of unfamiliar with some of the features of Java and some of the notions therein. So I thought, well, it'd be a good adaptation, and I think a lot of people still get value out of it. Actually, I still get people pull requesting and opening issues. So I'm glad it's got some legs.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io. Yeah, it's always nice to have resources out there that kind of give people the practical side of whatever it is that they're reading or working through. So, and when we talked, I think in 2017, you were working at Google. Are you still there?
Yeah, still am.
Oh, good deal. And we'll probably get to that a little bit later in your story, but is there anything else you got going on these days that you want to just highlight real quick? Or?
Yeah, I was talking to you before the show started. We were talking about non-technical interests and such, and I was mentioning, I think one of the things I had noticed at the beginning of this year was I was been so focused on technical things for almost the last 10 years, reading, algorithms books or reading the latest new JavaScript framework news and whatnot. And so I started kind of getting off of Twitter and getting away from some podcasts and not reading as many technical things and reading more nonfiction and fiction. But at the beginning of this year, I posted a repo under Google's account on GitHub. It's called Intermock, and I've actually been using that quite a bit. It's really good for basically taking TypeScript interfaces and then generating fake data for that. So if you have some sort of contract between your back end and your front end that's typed, you can get a lot of good mock data for testing and such.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's been very useful for me.
Cool. Well, let's jump in and talk a little bit about you and about your journey into coding. Just to get us started, I'm curious, how did you get into programming?
Well, winding back the clock to probably when I was born, my parents, they met on the job. They were both basically software engineers, although I don't think that was the job description at the time in the 1980s. And my dad was doing everything from electrical engineering on large VLSI transistors and such. And my mom was doing some low-level driver kernel work, and I believe it was at Motorola. And yeah, they basically throughout my childhood, throughout my life, have been, certainly very pro-education, pro-tech. And so I was privileged in that respect that they talked a lot about it. And then I got a computer, a ThinkPad, when I was 9, I believe it was. And it was one of those old ones that was really bulky. It had a pointing stick. I don't know if you remember what that was. There was a little like, not the trackpad, but a little mouse that was like in between your H and your N key.
Yeah, the little nub that was in there.
Yeah, the nub. And that was the kind of technology that exists. Of course, and beyond that, as far as internet goes, it was all dial-up. And so I was living on that for, till I was from like age 9 to 13 or 14. And then we finally got broadband in. But I was playing around with computers. I wouldn't say I was programming anything of consequence or importance. My dad gave me a Perl book. This was old school Perl, so this was like before classes. I think they've kind of changed up some of the language semantics and syntax, but this was old Perl, and I haven't touched it since. But the joke probably maybe still stands that it was write only, and he would write the code. And
still hear that.
I think it's can be that way in many languages, but for me with Perl, and maybe still so, it was very difficult to grok some of the syntax. And so I think that was probably for the first few years what I was playing around with. Again, nothing of real consequence. It was just sort of my free time outside of school. And it was also, I would say a little discouraging too, like I mentioned, because it was write only. I thought, oh my God, if this is what all of programming is like, I don't know if I can make it. Not to disrespect Perl or anything like that.
Yeah, it is interesting though. I know a number of people that either got into programming learning Perl or got their career, like once they knew how to code, their career kind of took off when they started learning Perl, because there was a time period where that was actually a really big deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was at that point in time, Perl had, I don't know if there was necessarily frameworks, but they had a pretty good CGI extension, so you could effectively write code towards Apache. There wasn't too much setup. It wasn't as easy as PHP, where you could just directly code and do it live in production. But it was a pretty easy way of interfacing. But of course, like I mentioned, with the caveat of the language being somewhat obtuse.
So you get into programming. What kinds of things did you build?
I was playing around for most of the time. And then when I was about 13, I think like a lot of folks that you might have talked to, that they really liked, computer gaming. I built my own PC with my friends, and I was interested in that. And so I was trying to build a submarine game because someone told me, hey, the only languages they program in for games are C and C++. You can forget all that Perl stuff. So I started programming C and a little bit of C++. And I was trying to build that submarine game because I was very into ships and that kind of thing. So I did not get very far on that. What I found at the time, and I can elaborate more on this in a sec, was there was just not a lot of resources. So it really was a lot of blind alleys, poking around. There wasn't too many frameworks. There was Steam at the time. I believe it was Half-Life Engine. I forget what it was. There was an open source engine, and they kind of abstracted some things, but you had to know classes and object-oriented programming, and I had no clue how to even approach it. And I think after a couple of years, I just got so incredibly discouraged, and I didn't even know how to do anything with malloc, and I barely knew the terminal. I kept forgetting what ls meant and how to navigate that. So I think after a while it just got discouraging, and I can elaborate more about thinking retrospectively why that might be, and why I'm kind of, I'd say, pretty jealous of people starting now. But that was the genesis, and I think after I was 15 or 16 or so, I tried to take the AP computer science test, and I did just miserably. I think I got like a 1 or a 2 out of 5. And that was definitely not going to cut it for anything like college, much less any kind of praise from others. So I kind of thought, maybe this whole programming thing is not for me. I put it on the back burner. I was still doing some websites, and I was doing computer repair.
Mm-hmm.
I'd always been interested in it, but that's kind of where I left off.
Interesting. It's funny because I think people get this idea that you either have it or you don't, right? Or and so if you're the genius level person that can become a programmer, that you're just gonna walk in and be able to just write code. And I think a lot of times people don't give a lot of credit to the idea that, I'm going to have to struggle through some of this. I mean, everything else in life's that way, right? To a certain degree, if I really want to master this, I'm going to have to struggle through some of it. And coding's not much different. So if you're interested in it, stick it out and see where you wind up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's great advice. And to that point, I think I was pretty inculcated with that notion that this was a thing that geniuses did or something to that extent. And, that's certainly not the case then. It's definitely not the case now.
Right.
And I got so discouraged because it was like dancing or singing or math or painting, a lot of these kinds of crafts and such, where you're constantly told, well, there's the Einsteins and the Picassos, and I'm sorry, you're not one, because we don't see you, proving relativity theory on day one.
Yeah. It's just interesting. Yeah. People get that idea in their head and that's it. And they also don't realize that Einstein and Newton and a lot of these other, people that we kind of hold up as geniuses, they spent a lot of time working through those theories, and they probably had a bunch of ideas that didn't work out. It just, eventually there was, okay, I've kind of worked my way around and I think I have a theory that works. And then you get the theory of relativity. But Einstein wasn't a young man when he came up with it.
Right. And that's, with programming, much like science, there's a huge amount of things that are stacked on top of each other. So I'd mentioned math as one of those things, and I think computer science being sort of a branch of that. It's very deductive and conceptual, and it builds on layers, and the software abstractions themselves too do the same thing. And what that means is there's this gradual accretion over time of things you got to know. And some things are abstracted, things like TCP/IP, and I can go on and elaborate more about kind of when I started learning all this stuff, that that stuff can be abstracted a little bit and you can kind of not worry as much about the details. But there's so many things that come up, and when you deal with tools that, at least at the time for me, were certainly not developer friendly, user friendly, it gets so defeating because you're just constantly running into walls. And it really does take much more so than anything like a genius intelligence. It just takes so much confidence and discipline to push past all that.
Yep. So how did you get around it? Because you said that you kind of got to the point where it got hard and you were thinking this might not be for me. So what did you do? Because I'm pretty sure the story ends with you being a software developer. So
yeah. So I was like 15 or 16 at the time. Like I mentioned, I got like a 1 or 2 on my test. And, coming from my background, my parents, they were very pro tech, as I mentioned. So I think it was, probably a little disappointing to them. And I think I kind of internalized more so any of their kinds of remonstrances towards that. I think I internalized a lot of, like I had mentioned, the kind of defeating ideas that I had and the experiences and the failure and the imposter syndrome that I think a lot of people still deal with, unfortunately. And it went about 4 or 5 years where I went into college. I didn't know what I wanted to do. My kind of main love, passion side stuff was programming. And I thought, well, I can't do this. So all the while I was studying things like philosophy, some mathematics, logic and such. So I was still very much in the domain of kind of deductive reasoning, which as I can go on and describe was actually pretty helpful, incidentally. But it really took until I was halfway through college and I was staring at debt and I was staring at what am I actually going to do with my life that I think people are, constantly go through. And that was when I was like, well, maybe I should just give this a literal college try. Maybe I should actually, try to read some books, try to start from first principles and relearn everything and see where I get. And that was when I was about 20, 21, and I have not looked back since, but that was the very, I would say, the real beginning to my story.
I love it, because basically what it was, and I just encourage people. It's like, if there's a particular place you want to go, I mean, go try, right? And I just love that you gain the confidence by going out and trying it. It's like, well, I'm not happy where I am, so I'm going to go try and do the thing that I enjoy.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. I didn't have too many mentors either, which that's one thing I'd recommend to anyone is try to find people. I think Twitter, as much noise and such as there can be on social media, there's a lot of really helpful folks, including myself. I really like when people reach out. Mm-hmm. There's so many people out there that will help you. And there's so many more resources now. When I was just starting just to play with it, 15 years ago, as it were, I mean, there was not GitHub. There was not YouTube. There was O'Reilly books, but there was not a lot of easy tooling. It was on Windows. Of course, no offense to anyone using that, but it was much harder on XP in those days. Mm-hmm. My goodness, it was so difficult to just cobble together the things that you needed. Now I think it's gotten a lot better. And like I said, I'm very jealous of people starting now. But I think notwithstanding that, there's still always going to be this pressure from the ideas you have about what you should be, and there's always going to be this pressure that you have about not failing, and you're going to fail so many times. I mean, so many times it's not going to compile. You're going to see some null or undefined is not a function. It's going to happen constantly, and you just have to remember, like we were saying, no one proves relativity theory on day one. It just takes that 10,000 hours just to get even close.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm kind of going to move us on a little bit. I'm curious how you've gotten into JavaScript then.
So when I was 21, I started doing websites for folks, and this was in WordPress, PHP, and just some straight HTML on live in production. And it was somewhere around the time after that where a few friends of mine had an idea to do effectively some social film creation site app. And I'm still very interested in film stuff and arts, and I liked all that. So I thought, we try this. And this was about 2012, so this is before React. And I picked up AngularJS, and I started playing with that. We started building out effectively, like a spa app. And it felt so much better than a lot of the other things that I was using at the time, certainly than like PHP. And that was probably the first moment. And then after that, we didn't raise enough money, as is the case with many startups. And I joined another startup. And there we were very focused on JavaScript related things, because it was an old Flash application. And that was when I really, really started to learn a lot. And we rebuilt a really complex mapping platform application. And we built it, from the ground up in JavaScript. And it was a wonderful learning experience.
Nice. You built it from the ground up using JavaScript. We're using Angular there as well.
We used Backbone, and I think I could go into it more about what I learned after you get to some order of magnitudes of lines, but it started to not scale. So we kind of cobbled together some solutions on top of that I thought were pretty good. But yeah, it was a lot of we certainly did use a lot of libraries. There's no way around that. So you can't make anything from scratch unless you make the universe. So we used a lot of stuff, but it was, I really didn't know how to build a huge software application. And that was the time I learned it.
Well, I think in that era when Backbone was really big and people were using it, a lot of people were figuring out how to build those big JavaScript applications. Because before then, you would just kind of sprinkle jQuery through to make things work, and then all of a sudden, you had this means of organizing and thinking about your code that allowed you to get a more complex app without necessarily scaling the complexity of what you had to understand in order to make it work.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, the explicit separation of, in effect, it was model view controller. The explicit separation was a first for me when I learned that, and in effect, we basically would lay out, in terms of design, what is a model going to look like? What is a controller going to look like? How we communicate? And I had done some jQuery before, and like you said, things were very coupled. Your jQuery code would have all this knowledge of your DOM. There was maybe an event system, perhaps, but you always knew, like, if I pressed this button, it would follow this code path, and it would have all this domain knowledge about what's on this page and what this widget does. And that, by definition, that high degree of coupling, which jQuery couldn't really give you any tools to get around, that was kind of this natural conclusion, and that's what didn't scale.
Right. So you're working in JavaScript, you work at a startup, doesn't quite take off. You work at the other startup. Did that one take off, or?
Yeah, we did pretty well, and we raised more money and got a lot more customers, and with that, we got a lot more feature requests and all that kind of really good positive feedback that you need as product developers. We got that, and I think at some point it was like tens of thousands of lines. I don't quite recall, and that was the first moment when I kind of realized, oh my goodness, I've made something I can't keep all in my head, and it was a lot of it was my own work, and so that was another impetus to get into clean code, to learn about strong type systems, to learn about really, really focused test-driven development. That was a really big catalyst, because when you can't understand your own program, and how is anyone else going to understand it?
Oh yeah. Yep. And I mean, nowadays we build apps where nobody can keep the whole app in their head. And so you have to have the organizational shortcuts. You have to have the concepts that are more or less built into the frameworks, like components and routes and things like that, so that even if you don't understand everything that's going on in there, you can at least kind of stumble your way to the right place before too long and figure out where the problem exists or where the feature needs to go.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Yeah, I think when tooling got better, and to kind of relate it back to an original point I had, was the tooling, I think, was so bad in so many different domains. That's not any kind of imputation on the people that worked on that. I think they just, it takes time to get anything great. And I think the web being so accessible to everybody, in effectively having an operating system running in your browser, and just being able to just drop into, in effect, a terminal, the console, that really, like, people pushed a lot of amazing stuff in there, and a lot of people stumbled on the same problems I had of, hey, why doesn't this scale? We have mutable state over here, and then something changes. The models have all this knowledge of other models. Okay, we need to rethink this. Stuff like React and better patterns started emerging, and I think that was a really positive development for me, and for anyone else. And I think, as I was describing, people now, I think, are really in a much better spot to start learning, because some of these pitfalls I hope are being avoided more now.
Right. So I'm curious then, how did you wind up at Google?
So one of the things I wanted to do was, after I built a pretty decent sized application, certainly not on my own. I had plenty of other people working with me, but when I was, it was 5 or 6 developers, and I thought, it would be wonderful to really up this to as big as possible. What does it look like to make really massive applications and systems, both in terms of just things on the front end, but all the way to the distributed systems and databases that power everything. I thought it'd be really cool to go join a place like that, and it I think it seemed out of the question at the time to join Google, given my background or perhaps lack thereof. But I read a lot. I did, fortunately or unfortunately, given the state of interviewing in the industry, did a lot of practicing, and I focused pretty hard on making that my next step, because I thought that would be where I want to see the kind of conclusion of this journey so far, before I start my next one, whatever that may be, about how do you build these huge systems. And that's kind of what really started to inspire me, and still inspires me today.
Nice. So just practice and preparation, huh?
Yeah, I would do, and I still do, for fun, problems. It doesn't, not necessarily always algorithms, but that was one part of it. But being able to explain my thinking, being able to reason about a problem from, like I was talking about, first principles, being able to think about what exactly are the data structures, because that's, in effect, that's really probably the more important piece than the algorithms, is how you structure the data. What data structures work for problems? And I think, as I alluded to, fortunately or unfortunately, there's a performance aspect to this. So just getting up and, being at a whiteboard or a computer or, podcast, and just trying to explain my thinking and reasoning while trying to be calm and focused. I think the confluence of all those things over probably the span of a year and a half, I was devoted to doing that. That's what precipitated me being able to actually join a place like Google.
Awesome. I'm really just kind of fascinated with the whole journey, and I'm curious, with all of the different things that you've done and been involved in and things like that. What's kind of a major highlight for you in your career?
That's a great question. I think a major highlight for me was probably the point where I realized that I could, just with my own experience, that I had some value to be able to teach people. I really enjoy doing that. When I was in college, before I really started on the actual college try of programming, I thought really deeply about being a professor, and I really enjoy contributing back. And so when I read through Clean Code, it was the second time in 2016, towards the end of that year, I thought, my goodness, there's so many people like myself that didn't know how to apply a lot of these really perennial concepts. And I thought, hey, I should just write something, and I should write it in a medium that can be updated by others with their own experiences and their own ideas. And I think when I did that, and I really started to try to push teaching and showing my experiences, I think that was probably has been the biggest highlight, because I think it's hopefully helped people grow, and I've certainly grown as someone who's more empathetic and someone who's a better communicator. And I want that to continue forever, no matter how long I'm in the industry.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is there something that you've built that you're particularly proud of? Any software that you've done that was challenging or rewarding in some way?
Yeah, I think outside of work, because I think it's difficult sometimes to talk about the work projects because there's so many people involved.
Right.
I think for me, probably the latest thing that I did, Intermock, that tool to generate fake data. for TypeScript interfaces. I thought that was such a great learning experience, because I didn't realize I still had, and I still will have, so many holes in my knowledge, and I didn't understand parsers and compilers very well. And so I went through the entire TypeScript design spec, and also JavaScript as well. And I learned all about how the AST is created, how things are, like, the lexer works, and things are tokenized. And it was really useful, because I learned how some of these design patterns, like the visitor design pattern, I learned at one point. I was like, how could that ever apply to anything? And then when I did this fake data generator, it immediately made sense. And it's a pretty small application. It's less than 1,000 lines of actual pure app code. But that was probably the most complex thing, certainly lately, outside of work. And I think that's been such a good learning experience to reinvigorate my passions in learning.
Nice. I believe we've talked a little bit about what you're working on now. Anything else you want to highlight?
I think one thing that has been top of my mind lately is, one of the best things I think people can do for themselves in their career is to get more domain knowledge in something else outside of just tech. I think people that are probably the most impactful have something else that comes together with programming. One of those things I like, which might sound a little bit boring to some folks, is supply chain logistics. And that was something that I was working on at the last job where I built that large app. But supply chains are why we have these microphones we're talking on now, these computers, which took 20,000, 30,000, however many suppliers and people just coordinating with each other, but indirectly. And these are these huge problems, and in effect, these massive graph problems of going through depth first to find better pricing through weights and all the other things that you'd find in a graph problem. They really you can take your computing knowledge and apply it to these other domains. And I think if you're just focused on tech, that's totally fine. But I think if you want to have impact in other areas, I think spend some of your time just reading something else. Doesn't have to be totally tied to economics or anything like that, or business, but there's so many other areas that can benefit. We're only 1% of the way there to transforming the world, and I think everybody has something they can give well outside of tech that can bring us further than 1%.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting too. I mean, you're mentioning the supply chain logistics, and I think the thing that made me think a little bit about it, and I'm not going to get too political on this, but there has been some talk in the news about tariffs. And so understanding how the tariffs affect the supply chain logistics and things like that, it seems like a lot of times people are talking about issues that they don't completely understand, or don't have at least a passable understanding of all of the things that get involved in them. And so I love just the idea of understanding the world, understanding how this stuff works. And then instead of throwing memes at each other, we can actually talk through these things and figure out, okay, this is how it actually works, or maybe this is how we could gain more knowledge in this area. And then, we're programmers, so we can model it, we can work through it, we can recreate parts of it in code, and then see where we get and have actual conversations about this stuff. I just find that both fulfilling and fascinating.
Very well said. Yes. I think that programming, the best thing that it gives you is it gives you the tools to be able to think about very complex systems, to be able to mitigate problems in complex systems, and in effect, eventually create your own complex system and have huge impacts on the world.
Yep, 100%. All right. Well, we're getting toward the end of our time, so I am going to push us toward picks. Do you have some things you want to shout out about on the show?
Well, I in a somewhat self-interested manner, talking about Intermock, the tool that I was working on. I think I plan to add some support for potentially other schema languages, probably protobufs going forward. But I think that's been a really fun tool for me. As far as other tools, I've been for the last 6 months just looking at totally other things outside of tech. So, I don't know some of the latest and greatest stuff, but I've been playing when I do have some time. Been playing with Rust and Haskell. That's been helping me think about some lower level problems and some deep type system things that have helped me in all the other languages I work in. So I'd encourage everyone to find another language if there's something that interests you, and it really will, no matter what, it'll help you in whatever language you're using on your job. And then, as far as other picks, I think reading various fiction, nonfiction books to expand your knowledge. I've been reading a lot of stuff in economics, a lot of stuff in history, stuff like Guns, Germs, and Steel. Those have been really good books. Sapiens has been awesome. And, after Game of Thrones, whatever you guys might think about that, I've been now on a new show. Has been watching Chernobyl. That's been quite good. And yeah, I think I'll probably get back sometime this summer to reading some more technical things. But I've been really enjoying not thinking about tech all the time.
Nice. I've heard really good things about Chernobyl, and of course, everybody's talking about Game of Thrones. So
yeah, there's some good memes. I still like to participate in that pop culture, but yeah, I think Chernobyl's been that's been a fun one for me.
Nice. I'm going to jump in here with maybe something a little bit more, I guess, direct as far as the problem goes. I have been working on redoing the devchat.tv website, basically to make it easier for people to get the information they want and find what they're looking for. And also, by virtue of the way that I'm doing it, I'm getting a huge amount of performance boost and things like that. So over the last several years, devchat.tv has been hosted on WordPress. In fact, each show had its own WordPress setup, and then we moved it all to a custom Rails application. I got tired of maintaining the Rails application, so I moved it all back to WordPress, but I put it all on one WordPress site. And the WordPress site has just gotten crazy to maintain. And I've had to write custom code in PHP in order to make it work, create custom post types and stuff like that. And I was playing around with the idea of moving it to a static site. And so that's kind of what I've done. So I've been pulling things together there, and I'm just going to throw together some of the systems that I'm using there to make it work. So I'm hosting the code on GitLab. No, on GitHub. It is on GitHub. So we'll be on GitHub there, and then and you can actually do pull requests and stuff too. I've had a few people come to me and say, I wish I could just fix the typos. And so, yeah, now you can do that with pull request. And I'll put a link to the repo in the show notes. And then I am also using a static site generator called Eleventy. It's written in JavaScript, and I'm really, really digging it. It's pretty nice. I've had a few things that I wish it had. It would, maybe being a little bit more fully featured, but I'm pretty happy with it. And then I'm hosting it on Netlify. Now, Netlify is a sponsor of several of the shows, full disclosure, but I freaking love what they've got. And so I've been using that. I've been playing with it a bit. By virtue of the sponsorship, I also get to try out some of their new and upcoming features. And I'm pretty excited about some of the stuff coming down the pipe that, I can't really talk about at the moment. But also Netlify Dev, which is a command line tool. Oh my gosh, I can't even tell you how much I like it. So I'm going to pick all of that stuff. I have a few other things I'm using Discuss for my comments, which means that I just embed JavaScript on it. So static site, that's all great. I have found a couple of other marketing tools that I'm going to be pulling in. But yeah, all in all, I am super happy with it. And so anyway, go check out all of those tools. One last question, Ryan. How do people find you if they want to connect with you online?
Yeah, I'm available on Twitter. I don't post as much anymore, but feel free to reach out to me. My handle is Raiconoclast. And I'm also on GitHub, as I mentioned, with some of my projects. That's github.com/Ryan McDermott.
Awesome. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this one up, folks. Thanks for coming, Ryan.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful.
All right. Well, we will catch everybody next week. Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.